Hello, everyone. This is Majeed. I'm speaking to you from the United Nations headquarters in New York City. As you can see, the headquarters are empty due to lockdown because of COVID-19, this global pandemic. Most of the United Nations staff are working from home. We are interviewing Mr. Elliott Harris. He's the Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. He's the Chief Economist of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs here at the United Nations. They recently published a report that basically makes predictions and projection about global economy, oil price, how this crisis, this global health crisis, will impact the global economy. We keep hearing about recessions, but how big that recession will be based on all the data that the United Nations get. Mr. Harris, we hope to answer our questions. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I would like to ask first to start asking about how this global pandemic, give us an image, how this will impact the world economy?
Well, I think the impact is affecting the economy through two different channels. On the one side, we had at the beginning the disruptions of supply chains as China in particular started to shut down in response to the initial outbreak. Those supply chain interruptions, they disrupted production in all sorts of different sectors all around the world, and that was the first downward impulse. But then as the virus continued to spread over other countries and more countries started to take aggressive measures to restrict the spread, the lockdown measures, the restrictions on business, on being contact, the imposition of social distancing, that deeply affected demand, private demand. And so you've had this two-sided effect, the supply side interruptions on the one hand, and then the deep contraction of demand on the other. And in addition to this, we now have a situation where, because of the lockdowns and the restrictions, the social distancing and so on, there are many individuals who simply cannot earn income. The jobs that they do require close proximity, and those jobs have been suspended. Much of the economy, many sectors have been literally shut down. This has never happened before in recorded history. And so the economy just simply isn't functioning and has been brought to a halt in many sectors and in large parts of the world. And so this is a confluence of different factors that has accentuated the downturn. And this is what is making this recession probably one of the most aggressive recessions we've seen outside of wartime.
In terms of numbers, what is the expectation of the United Nations regarding the recession? How big of a recession we should expect in the next couple of years?
Well, we have had to completely redo our projections, and that is one of the problems that we have in the present situation. Things change so rapidly. But whereas at the beginning of the year, we were expecting the global economy to grow weekly, but by about 2% and 2.5%, we've had to revise our estimates downward. And our baseline estimate now is that the overall economy of the world will contract, will shrink by 3.2%. So that's a shift of more than 5.5% from 2.5% of positive growth, which we estimated at the beginning of the year, well, at the end of the year and published at the beginning of the year. And now we're expecting a decline of 3.2. Now, that assumes that the major restrictions to economic activity come to an end by the end of the second quarter, and that we are in the full recovery mode by the third quarter. Now, of course, if it takes longer to get things back on track, then of course the downturn will be even worse.
And what are the factors that will impact the recovery to make it faster or slower? If you give us general,
I would see two things. One is we have major stimulus packages in place in many countries, not in all, but in many countries, and they have had the effect of propping up to some extent economic activity to the extent that that was possible. I think one key factor is that we will need to maintain that stimulus for a certain period of time, even after we have started to reopen the economies. Because if we start to withdraw the support too soon, it might take a lot of the steam away from the possible recovery. The second point is that much of the effort has been to preserve enterprises, firms, prevent them from going bankrupt, and prevent people from slipping out into unemployment. And in fact, some countries have actually gone so far as to pay some or all of the wages of people in affected sectors. And the idea here is to prevent the disappearance of enterprises. Because once they go bankrupt and they shut down their doors, then they are no longer there to take part in the recovery. And that means the recovery itself will be slower. It'll generate less income for people than we had before the crisis broke out, and it will be slower, you see. And so this is one of the big questions that we have. How many of the enterprises will have survived the shutdown, you see? And right now, the data on that are very, very incomplete. We don't have a clear picture. In some sectors, it's easier to understand than in others, but it's a problem that has affected all sectors of virtually all economies.
Can we ever go back to the way things was before COVID? Isn't this, I know future is very hard to predict, but aren't you already seeing, if people travel less, if people are reluctant to go out, aren't you seeing even industries disappearing or changing in a fundamental way?
I think we've seen the beginning of some of the changes. As you say, I mean, people have, they have found, those who were able to continue working by working from home, they and their employers will have found that this is more possible than anybody would have thought before the crisis. Yeah? And we have seen certain business reports that have indicated that some big companies are actually preparing for a post-crisis future where they have less of their employees actually coming into their premises to work, so that working from home can become more of a standard operating modality rather than an exception or a crisis response. Now, if we were to have that happen, then we would see changes in real estate markets, for example. The amount of commercial real estate that companies have to rent in order to house their employees, that might change. And that would have implications for other aspects of the real estate market and possibly for asset prices more generally. We will see that there is perhaps a lot more flexibility in working arrangements, that employers are willing to allow people to work at flexible or staggered hours, understanding that, well, the work will get done, but since they don't have to all be in the same place at the same time to do the work, there could be more flexibility in that respect. I think we'll see that some of the types of demand that we have experienced in the past may change. We've had people who have got used now to demanding less public transportation, for example, and there's less demand for energy because there's so much less activity. And there's an opportunity then, as we go back up and ramp back up our demand for energy, there's a possibility, and we hope there's actually a real possibility, that people will shift their demand towards more renewable sources of energy, for example, or change their behavior. They are consuming less now, and perhaps they will revisit the way in which they spend their money in the future. And that might lead to changing patterns of consumption, which hopefully will be more sustainable as we go forward. And this is a really key point. This is what the Secretary General has called recovering better, building back better, is that even as we put in place measures to deal with the immediate emergency, we should always keep an eye out to the recovery and hopefully adjust our measures so that as we recover in more sustainable ways. And hopefully we will see changes in some of the structures of the economy that contribute to greater sustainability over time.
And all this requires some sort of multilateral effort, a global effort. And I want to ask about the impact. I mean, we all know the United States economy is so globalized. Definitely a crisis at a global level will impact the domestic economy in the US. How big of an impact the recession all around the world would impact the United States economy?
Well, we are estimating that the US economy, under present projections, now this is again our baseline, is going to contract by somewhat less than 5% in 2020. 4.8% is our latest estimate. Now, when you compare that last year, at the beginning of the year, we had projected a positive growth of about 1.7%. So it's a huge shift. It's more than 6 percentage points of shift. Now, again, all of that depends on the assumption that, the recovery picks up relatively quickly. And it also depends more or less on the assumption that the global supply chains pretty quickly return to functioning the way they used to function before, and that the upsetting disputes in the trade area don't repeat themselves, because that was a major disruption last year. And we also hope that this would, well, it would mean as well that commodity markets come back into a relative balance pretty quickly, so that the demand for the products of the United States and the demand of the United States for products from elsewhere can quickly swing back up to pre-crisis levels. Now, if that happens, then we would have a loss of about 5 percentage points of GDP growth. But if it doesn't happen as quickly, or if the recovery in other parts of the world is not as strong, then of course the overall impact on the US economy would be more pronounced.
Definitely, and I want to ask, like, there are people, including President Trump and others, they're saying, let's forget about the supply chain. Let's be less dependent on the global supply chain. Let's just change all that, and just this is a way to moving forward. Is that even possible now? And this,
it would be difficult, but it would also be, in my mind, ill-advised. One of the things that we have seen, and I think all observers have noticed this and agree upon this, is that trade, although it has its difficulties, has been a force that contributes to economic progress. Now, of course, this is not an entirely positive picture in every respect. There have been shifts in markets to the extent that, for example, some commoditized or routine manufacturing processes have been offshored. That has become possible because of the integration of global economies through trade. The global supply chains have made that possible. Of course, in those countries that are losing the manufacturing jobs, this aspect of globalization is perceived as negative. But what it also brings along with it is a global market that is much more prosperous and much more able to consume the products and the services produced in the American economy or in the German economy or in the Australian economy. And that is, I think, on balance, a much more positive factor than the perturbations and the shifts in markets that happens as a result of the integration. And let us not forget that even we're now in an era that is highly globalized. But even before we had globalization in this extent, there have always been these shifts, these sectoral changes, these transformations that happen as economies develop. So it would be, I think, a serious problem and a serious setback for the recovery as well if countries were to turn inward. Instead, I think it would be far more suitable and far more beneficial to all countries for there to be a coordinated support for the multilateral trading system, for example. We have the rules, we have a system, let us strengthen the system so that it operates more effectively rather than turn away. We know that trade has been beneficial to most of those who participate in it, but of course not to everyone. But what we should do is find ways to help those who are suffering from the consequences of trade rather than trying to make everybody else suffer by not trading. And I think that those are lessons that all governments would be well advised to keep in mind and understand that a short-term reaction saying we'll close our borders or restrict trade or otherwise turn inward, that will not generate a similarly positive outcome in terms of recovery or growth into the future.
Before I move to the topic of oil, I want to ask you, historically, give us a perspective, how bad this recession will be compared to other global economic crises we had in modern history?
Well, again, you asked me how bad this recession will be.
Yeah, based on
let me take out my crystal ball and shine it up a little bit. Again, we have to make assumptions as to when the economic activity will resume. But again, our assumptions are such. We have a projection now of a global decline of 3.2% in this year. And as far as these things go, that is not the worst annual decline of the global economy that we've registered. I mean, in the Great Depression, back in 1929, it was much worse. And that was a depression. That wasn't a recession. It was a depression that lasted for almost 3 years. Well, no, more than 3 years, 43 months. The global economy did not grow. We are not yet at that stage, but there are some perturbing factors. In the Great Depression, it was a loss of confidence more than anything else that sort of pushed the economy into decline. And then that fed upon itself. Here we have a situation where, because of the health crisis, the economy is not allowed to function. People can't go out to work. And we've had an increase in unemployment that is really spectacular. It sounds like a positive way. It really has not happened this way as quickly at any time. I mean, the Great Depression, there was a massive amount of unemployment, yes, but that built up much more gradually over time. And so I think the challenge that we will face here in recovering from this recession is, once the economic activity is reopened and starts back, is getting people back out to work. That's the key point, because until we do that, global demand is going to be well below previous levels, and that will be a drain on the recovery. So if I were to make a sort of a guesstimate of what might happen, I would think that if we can keep the virus spread under reasonable control, and if we can get a vaccine developed within the next few months, so that people can be comfortable going back out and interacting with others, then we could see a recovery begin next year. And hopefully that recovery would be quite strong, because we may not yet have suffered permanent damage to the structures of the economy. Now, the longer this shutdown persists, the more enterprises will go bankrupt, the more people will be unemployed for longer periods of time, and so more difficult to re-employ, and the more likely we'll have prolonged damage that would make it difficult to recover quickly.
I wanted to ask you about the price of oil.
Yeah.
A lot of anxieties, especially in oil-rich countries that depend on oil.
Yes.
What is the United Nations expectation with that regard? I mean, I know it's very hard to expect the price of oil, but there are some indications included also in your reports.
That's correct. Again, the price of oil has suffered from the shift in economic demand. You know, as entire sectors have reduced their output, the demand for energy has fallen off, and that has been driving the decline in energy and bringing down prices. There was also a bit of a perturbation in the market between two major producers concerning pricing policies, and that uncertainty contributed as well to weakening oil prices.
Okay.
So we have pardon?
So Russia and Saudi Arabia.
That's correct. And so we've had a problem here where the supply conditions on the global markets were under a bit of a question mark because of that, and the demand conditions were disappearing rapidly. And so the oil market itself is in a particularly weak position, and the demand for energy can only recover when economic activity picks back up. So again, that is what, happily, or in any event, the oil sector, because it is a key to the provision of energy, it is one of those sectors that will recover quickly when economic activity reopens. But again, it's taken a very, very big hit. Now, one issue that might come into play, even as the recovery begins, is that production wasn't shut down immediately, production of oil, I mean. And so we had continued production, which sort of created massive stockpiles of petroleum. And these stockpiles actually got so important that they drove prices into negative territory for a while on some US markets, futures markets. And those stockpiles will have to be brought back down before the normal conditions of supply and demand can reestablish themselves. So if we are sort of cautiously estimating that there'll be a bit of a lag before oil prices can actually start to recover, even after the economic recovery picks up, simply because those stocks of oil have to be sort of brought into circulation and sold. And then when we get back to more normal relationships in stocks and market demand, then we can see prices start to stabilize, if you will.
What are your advice to the oil-dependent, oil-rich countries, especially countries that are highly dependent on oil in this time? What should they do, the government should do?
This is a very difficult situation because any commodity-dependent economy, especially an economy dependent on oil as a major source of export revenue and fiscal revenue, is going to have far fewer resources available to react to the crisis. Yeah. So it'll be difficult to put in place generous fiscal stimulus packages in the oil producing countries simply because the amount of revenues that they're generating is much lower. But what this crisis does, I think, also illustrate is the vulnerability that comes from being too heavily dependent on a particular commodity. And it's not just for oil. I mean, there are other economies that depend on copper, for example, or on cobalt. And these are things that are a source of good earnings in good times, but they're also a source of vulnerability should anything go wrong in that one market. And so one lesson we would hope is underscored, is emphasized by the experience of the COVID crisis, is that it is in an economy's interest to do whatever it can, as soon as it can, to diversify its economic structures, to reduce the exposure, if you will, to one product, because that is a potential source of vulnerability, as recent events have shown.
My last topic I want to discuss with you is United Nations. What is the United Nations doing right now in order to at least elevate and help countries deal with this global economic now crisis, not just health crisis?
That's right. Well, from the very beginning, the Secretary General issued a major statement within a week of the full outbreak, where he spoke about the imperative of a consolidated, internationally coordinated response to the health crisis. Because the key and absolute imperative is to contain the virus, prevent it from spreading too far, too fast, and prevent it also from overwhelming public health systems. And in many developing countries, this is a very serious problem. The second question is to put in place the measures that will support people, especially the vulnerable people, in this period of crisis. And we had encouraged all countries, to the extent they could, to put in place stimulus packages. And we encouraged all countries to make those stimulus packages as powerful as possible, but also to the extent possible, to help in a coordinated international response to assist countries that didn't have the fiscal space to make major fiscal stimulus packages. And then the third element is to take advantage of this crisis and the opportunity that it offers to rethink some of the ways that we do our business, live our lives, and recover better. We should think about the way in which we can use this crisis and use the recovery from this crisis to shift ourselves onto a path of greater sustainability. Mm-hmm. Now, what we did was we put in place, as at the UN, a multi-donor trust fund that would allow us, first and foremost, to support the public health effort led by the WHO. And the entire UN development system has come together and produced a framework under which we will take the existing programs that we have for development and adjust them, adapt them to respond to the imperatives of the crisis in developing countries around the world. And this is in several pillars. It includes a macroeconomic side. It looks at labor markets, for example. In most important pillar at the beginning of the whole approach was the health side. And what we are doing is using what we have already in place and repurposing our interventions to provide a targeted support to member states as they respond to the crisis. Keeping in mind as well, however, that as we maintain that support and continue past the immediate crisis, we want to be able to encourage and assist countries in making policies that are more oriented towards sustainable development as we recover from the crisis.
And how you do all that with I'm at the United Nations headquarters right now. It's closed. You're all working virtually. Can you tell me how this lockdown impacted your work? Is global diplomacy, can global diplomacy function virtually?
It is a struggle. I think we have been pleasantly surprised at how much we are actually able to do virtually. But there are some times when the ability to meet would have been helpful in the present circumstances. There are some times when we have discussions virtually and online, and they tend to deal with the most pressing issues, and some of the other issues surrounding these topics don't get as much full treatment because we're not with each other face to face. So that is indeed a problem. It's also been very difficult, I think, particularly for those activities where a physical presence is necessary, and I'm speaking in particular of the peacekeeping and the humanitarian activities that the UN is responsible for, to maintain the standard of quality and the standard of full engagement. But of course, we have to do that, and there's only so much adjustment that we can make with regard to some of those peacekeeping and humanitarian activities as we look at the crisis. We spent a lot of time trying to prevent the infections from taking control, for example, in refugee camps. We've made a concerted appeal. The Secretary General has been very insistent upon this, that all parties to any form of conflict need to set their differences aside and focus on this one problem that unites us all, so that we can deal with this quickly and hopefully build upon that collaborative spirit to resolve the crises once and for all. Unfortunately, we do see that there hasn't been quite as much willingness, I think, or ability, for whatever reason, to set aside some of the persisting problems that the world is confronted with. And unfortunately, this does make the international collaboration and the cooperation and coordination that we need more difficult to achieve. Now, we hope that as I say, that the containment measures are successful, and that we will be able to relatively soon conceive of coming back to, I wouldn't say business as usual, because we want to change the way we operate in certain respects, but hopefully we will not be so forced to stay so far away from each other. And hopefully then we'll be able to take some of the new ways of working that we've experimented with and succeeded with, and bring some of them into the new future. Our new work day, our new environment is going to be different to the one we knew before the crisis, and hopefully it'll be more effective and more efficient as well.
I hope so too. Thank you very much, Mr. Elliott Harris, Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. I really appreciate your insights, and I hope you remain healthy and safe.
Thank you very much. Same I wish to you and your family, and to all of us around the world.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.